All right, welcome everyone to the August 2020 Tribal Climate Webinar. My name is Stefan Tangent. I work as a Tribal Resilience Liaison for the North Central region. I cover the states of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And I work directly for the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance in coordination with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the NCCASC. You can see our website up here. I've also put all the links that I'm going to show during my share screen in the chat in case you want to go directly to those locations. The University of Colorado is the university host of the Climate Center.
Stefan, we're seeing what you read, not your...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate that. My share screen. Okay. There we go. How about now? Better?
Yeah, we're seeing the website now.
Awesome. Thank you, Aparna. Okay. Here's our North Central Climate Adaptation Science website. There we go. The University of Colorado is also the university host of the Climate Center. I also live in the Front Range near Denver, so I'd like to acknowledge that the university sits on land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Additionally, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. The goal of this webinar is to provide information, tools, and resources for climate adaptation practitioners at tribal nations. Through this webinar, we aim to create a community of practice to share work going on across the region and the country. I encourage you to ask questions and participate in the discussion. And you're welcome to use the chat box to do so at any point during the webinar, or you can take yourself off mute when appropriate. I'm guessing Gary's going to wait till the end for questions. So just note that. Also note that we are recording this. All the recordings are going to be on the website, and as well on the YouTube channel here. The chat is also included in that recording, just so you know. And then we also have a monthly newsletter covering climate adaptation at tribal nations. If you're interested in that, that link is also in the chat box. All right, so I have a couple quick announcements before I introduce Gary. First, as many of you may know, the National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Conference will take place September 14 to 17. And if you have not registered, that link is in the chat. It closes the 31st of August. I'll be facilitating a couple sessions there, including a Montana Tribal Climate Working Group and a funding conversation about ways to improve funding mechanisms for tribal climate adaptation, particularly regarding implementation. And there's going to be a ton of really interesting sessions, so I encourage you to attend. It's free. Secondly, the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals is leading an effort to put together a report called The Status of Tribes and Climate Change, or STAC. And the goal with that report is to amplify voices and experiences at tribal nations that don't often get that opportunity. The report will be then used as a reference for policymakers, decision makers, and for other publications, including the upcoming National Climate Assessment. And you're welcome to reach out to me directly if you would like to learn more. And I'll put my email in the chat here in a second. All right, our speaker today is Gary Morishima. Gary has served as the Natural Resources Technical Advisor to the President of the Quinault Indian Nation since 1974 and is an affiliate professor with the University of Washington School of the Environment and Forest Science. He was a founder of the Intertribal Timber Council and a member of its executive board for 30 years. He has worked on numerous boards and committees, including the Salmon and Steelhead Advisory Commission and Intergovernmental Advisory Committee for the Northwest Forest Plan. More recently, he was a member of the Department of Interior Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resources Science, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Native American Policy Team, and an author on the 4th National Climate Assessment. He worked on the salmon technical team of the Pacific Fishery Management Council for over 25 years and on several technical committees of the Pacific Salmon Commission since 1985. Gary was part of the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group that created the guidelines for considering traditional knowledges in climate change initiatives, which is up here. I'm sharing that on my screen. The link for that is also in the chat in case you want to explore that website further. During his career, Gary was involved in numerous legislative and policy matters pertaining to forestry, fisheries, self-determination, and endangered species. He holds a BS in mathematics and a PhD in quantitative science and environmental management from the University of Washington. Welcome, Gary. Thanks so much for coming on the webinar. I'm going to stop my share. You're welcome to go ahead and share your screen. Looks good. All right, you're all set.
All right. Well, hopefully you can see the screen. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. I'm honored to have been invited to share some food for thought with you today. I'm Gary Morishima. I've been privileged to have worked with Indian country for over 50 years. I guess that makes me as old or older than the hills. But I started my life's journey after being inspired by Rachel Carlson and her book, Silent Spring. Her book opened my eyes and helped me to begin to understand why I was seeing some really troubling things that were happening around me. I'm going to talk about life, the importance of perception, and the Quinault experience with village relocation. Today, our lives have become chaotic. Discourse and deliberation are giving way to tweet storms. Discord and divisiveness abound. We're seeing environmental protections being dismantled. Demonstrations are turning into full-blown riots in places like Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, and even our nation's capital. COVID is disrupting our personal lives, social, economic, and political systems. Our home is changing due to years of neglect and indifference. The world is sick and getting sicker. Storms are becoming more frequent and intense. Wildfires are becoming bigger. We're facing floods, drought, sea level rise. Our habitats needed by the animals and plants that we rely upon for food and medicine are being affected. A tsunami of paper, videos, and noise from social and mass media floods our senses and minds. We're bombarded by so many messages, reports, lies, misinformation, and disinformation that we sometimes have trouble distinguishing fact from fiction. The University of Washington even found it necessary to establish a class called Calling Bullshit to help students recognize and counter the onslaught. Well, what's in store for tomorrow? By 2050, our home could be shared by as many as 9.7 billion people. Technological advances will bring about changes we can scarcely imagine today. Social, economic, and political systems are being reshaped. The only thing certain is uncertainty. Perception determines how we see the world and our place in it. It really depends upon your point of view, and there are many different points of view. So imagine if you were inside a blue bubble, and all you'd see is on the right of your screen there, nothing but blueness. Perception depends upon time, place, and circumstance, and it's influenced by the past, the things that we've been taught before and that we may be unaware of. We often do not even think about the baggage that we may bring us with us. Our vision and perceptions can be very myopic. So it's important that we be aware of our limitations and our worldviews. If we look through a keyhole, we can only see a tiny part of our environment. When we look closer through the keyhole, we can see more of the world. And when we look beyond the world, we can see that the world is part of something more. Our world is dominated by COVID. Imagine if you were inside the virus. This is what you'd see: inconveniences and disruption, signs of despair, hopelessness, and selfishness. You'd see a mindset based on the idea that growth and consumption are good and desirable. You'd see a mindset that needs to be changed if we are to survive. COVID has a silver lining. It's given us a chance to really stop and think. When we think and open our eyes, we begin to understand. Slowly but surely, the pandemic is reminding us that all things are interdependent. We are beginning to see the relationships between the environment and pandemics. If we are to address COVID, we need to address the destruction of the environment and climate change as well. We are beginning to see and understand that the pandemic is part and a symptom of global change. COVID is a harbinger of things to come. It's a wake-up call, something we can't ignore. The tidal wave of human, economic, environmental, and political consequences can be overwhelming. Our home is changing fast. COVID and climate change have the same cause. It's us. The disruption caused by COVID has shown us the impossibility of fixing the unfixable. Like Humpty Dumpty, it will be beyond the power of all the king's horses and all the king's men to put Humpty back together again. It's clear that we will need to do something different. We have the chance to reshape economic and political forces to create a green economy. COVID is sending us a message. We need to change, and now we have the chance. It's up to us to take it. Our perceptions must be expanded to enable us to see beyond today, to think of yesterday and tomorrow. When we look to the past, we see the wisdom of tribal worldviews that we owe what we are today to our ancestors and see that all things are connected. We need to remember that tribal peoples have been here for a long time and that they have faced climate change, disease, and social trauma before. They have survived by being able to adapt, by facing difficult challenges and making hard choices. When we look to the future, we can see the need to be respectful and inclusive of all sources of information and knowledge. We can see our responsibility to make our decisions knowing that our children will be left to bear the consequences. We see that we must reshape our relationships to the environment and each other if we are to survive. COVID and climate change are big, hard, and complex problems, but we can't ignore them or pretend they don't exist. They will not magically just go away. We can't conjure up false solutions to real problems. There is increasing awareness and interest in bringing the wisdom, science, and worldviews and their perspectives of Indigenous peoples to bear on today's challenges. We will need to blend different worldviews and knowledge systems, including traditional intergenerational knowledge, to enable us to survive. Each way of knowing, whether it's Western science, local or scientific knowledge systems, all of them can and must inform our decision-making for sustainable management of ecosystems. Each way of knowing has its own strengths and weaknesses, Neither is superior to the other. They're not competitive, but they're complementary. Each way of knowing has its own identity and can contribute to the strength of the whole. I want to share a story now about how the Quinault Nation is blending modern science, traditional knowledge, and cultural values to deal with village relocation. Quinaults have a word that's drawn from their past to describe a major challenge that is facing today. Nos CLEARCUTS. It means water coming. The Quinaults have produced a film to tell you about what they're doing about village relocation. The Quinault homelands lie on the Pacific coast in what is now the state of Washington. The Quinault Reservation encompasses over 220,000 acres of forest lands. The two main villages of Tahola and Queets lie at the mouths of rivers that originate in the rainforests of the Olympic Mountains. Quinaults are peoples of the land and sea, with a natural resource culture and economy that still is sustained by fish, wildlife, and plants. Quinaults have been here for thousands of years, before the last ice age. We see reminders of it in the river systems. Just recently, a mammoth tusk was found in the clay banks along the Quinault River. In 1923, they found a 13-foot tusk. In 2020, there was a 10,000-year-old carving of a mammoth found on the Quinault Reservation. Quinaults have been here for a long time. They have survived climate change, disease, and trauma. They are rooted in the past, but have adapted, applying modern technology and science to their daily lives. The land of the Quinault is shaped by the awesome power of the ocean. Storms blur the connection between land and sea, and surges from ocean storms flood Quinault villages, and copious amounts of rainfall can cause landslides that cut off access to the outside world. Besides the forces of nature, Quinaults have experienced the brunt of destructive logging practices that led to long-term environmental degradation of their lands and rivers. But the Quinaults did not stand idly by. In the late 1960s, Quinault leaders aggressively opposed continued destruction of their homelands. In the 1970s, tribal leadership seized the opportunity to assume greater control over the natural resources and enactment of the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act. New resources, science, and capabilities were brought to bear. Expertise was brought on board, information came to light about how the land was formed and about continuing threats of future change. Scientific studies revealed the glacial history of the land and evidence of tsunamis that had given rise to the communal memories that led to the term Nos CLEARCUTS. The evidence of tsunamis that were repeated tsunamis was clear, and the causes were brought to light. The Cascadia Fault off the coast of Washington and Oregon has fractured numerous times, including an earthquake in 1700 that caused a major tsunami in Japan. And modern science has brought information about increasing awareness of global warming and concerns for sea level rise. There's really too much at stake to ignore them. And information about changes that are happening thousands of miles away are raising even more alarms. Modern science has brought new information to bear. The subduction zone and the scenarios are pretty dramatic and pretty frightening. Something has to be done to prepare the main villages of Tahola and Queets, which lie on the ocean and at the mouths of those rivers, to protect them from both sudden and gradual threats from the ocean and storms and climate change. Emergency response systems have been put in place to prepare for tsunamis, and concerted efforts have been initiated for village relocation. Western and traditional science were brought to bear. Resources were found to prepare a master plan for relocation. Community science, community involvement was called upon to imagine a village. What is it that they want their village to look like in the future? The plan would provide a risk assessment and serve as a foundation for moving a whole community. Engineers, planners, and computers were employed to formalize the framework plan. But because, excuse me, relocation would take a lot of time and money, the plan was designed to be opportunistic, to take advantage of resources as they became available. So when funds became available to build a school, a museum, a senior center, community center, we knew where they were going to go and where to put them in order to provide a reality to the vision that was set forth in the framework plan. Updates are constantly provided to keep the Quinault citizenry informed. And village relocation is a massive undertaking, requiring strong leadership and communication to deal with the physical, economic, and emotions that are involved. The task is beyond the means of the Quinault Nation alone. Since the 1970s, the political and economic influence of the Quinault Nation has grown and helped to bring technical and financial assistance to the table. It takes a tribal government to implement the village relocation plan. Tribal government has a duty and the means to act in accordance with tribal values. Treaty rights and federal trust responsibilities can be mustered, and relationships with local, state, and federal governments can bring technical and financial assistance. Dealing with threats from tsunamis, global change, and sea level rise is complex and hard, but the challenges can't be ignored. It would only be delusional to think that they will just go away. They've got to be faced. Our experience with village relocation illustrates the resilience of the Quinault people in finding a way to protect their communities by facing formidable challenges. Of blending modern science, communal experience, and economic and political forces together, it's a lesson in adaptation. It's a lesson in hubris too, recognizing that some things are uncontrollable and that everything is connected, that we have neighbors near and far that we have to be aware of and take care of. It's a recognition that stuff happens and that we've got to expect the unexpected. It's something that tells us we have to be prepared to respond to both emergency and gradual change, to adjust or modify, to produce outcomes that are either more desirable or less undesirable. And it's a lesson that we've got to be opportunistic and nimble, creative, apply the tools that we have available to us, and keep options open. We have to be able and learn to adapt. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope that I've left you with a few morsels of thought to munch on as you embark upon your life's journey. I'd be happy to hear your comments and to try to respond to any questions.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, a couple other people in the chat saying thank you. Folks are welcome to type in a question if they have one, or welcome to also take yourself off mute if you want to ask one directly to Gary.
Did we put everybody to sleep?
Doesn't look like it. Getting some people saying thank you. I can ask one while people are thinking of questions or considering what you just presented, because I know there are other issues that the community deals with. Salmon is a huge one, with the specific species of salmon getting less and less each year, and that fishery collapsing. Can you talk about maybe the other issues around climate change that you're concerned about, and how you've kind of been able to prioritize those different issues and address them, specifically related to climate change?
Stefan, I couldn't quite catch it. Your question, did you ask a question of me?
I did. Yeah, maybe it's just choppy and not coming through. My question was, I know there are other issues related to climate change that the community is concerned about, and I was just curious about what those were, how they've been able to prioritize those issues, and how you've gone about addressing them other than relocation.
Well, there are many challenges that the Quinault and other people are facing, of course, with climate change. And it's always a difficult task to figure out which are most important and which are more important than others. I've been working on a number of factors that deal with things like what's happening with our forests, for example, with species being relocated. We've got invasive species issues. Dealing with restoration of some of the river systems and environments that sustain the fish and wildlife and plants that are important for the tribal communities. I've also been involved in the international arena, where Quinaults have been taking more and more responsibility, I think, for trying to develop policies and programs that are suitable and appropriate for application to the challenges that many of the indigenous peoples around the world are facing.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that, Gary. It looks like is it Malio? Do you have a question?
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. My name is Malio Kotis, and I'm curious, Gary, if you could speak to partnerships between tribes and other organizations, whether that's governments or academic institutions or environmental organizations, partnerships that have gone particularly well, and how those partnerships are designed so that they did go well. I'm curious specifically about just engagement and sort of the logistics of partnerships for success.
Sure, I'll try to address those. That's a very interesting topic and a very complex one, actually. As you know, today tribes have largely been relegated to their reservation lands. So we are dealing with essentially islands of Indianness, and the recognition that the islands are surrounded by other entities, other systems of knowledge, other systems of governance. It's also recognition that things like we're dealing with climate change and COVID, for example, that these are worldwide phenomena. There are things that are accumulating to affect the Quinault people and their homelands. Forces that happened thousands of miles away and many years ago are coming to root now. And in order to deal with them, you have to be able to work with your partners, with your neighbors. You have to understand how your actions are affecting them. They have to understand how their actions are affecting you. The Quinauts are governments. The Quinault Nation is a government. And as such, it has certain political relationships. It's got certain rights and responsibilities. It shares a public trust for protecting the environment that all of us share. It's that kind of connection, the commonness, the common value, and the common responsibility for stewardship that the Quinault Nation has been bringing to the forefront. It has pressed for things like the necessity to utilize the best available science and to bring all the resources that are available to bear when we're dealing with problems that are shared. The fish, wildlife, and plants, for example, that are essential to the ability of the Quinauts to exercise their treaty fishing rights. They don't care about the modern boundaries that have been established, political relationships, the jurisdictional spats or disputes. So you have to find a way to craft, if you will, a common vision, a way in which we can recognize that we have differences, but we have commonalities, and that there are certain things that we have to work together to do if we are going to preserve the environment and the resources that we all love and depend upon. I'm not sure if that addresses your questions. There have been things like memorandums of understanding that have been developed and reached with our neighbors, for example, the Olympic National Park. We have established certain kinds of guidelines and principles for how we're going to administer things like the Endangered Species Act. You may be aware of Secretarial Order 3206, which was developed in recognition that there was a train wreck that was coming down our way, a train wreck that would pit tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, and things like the Endangered Species Act against one another. So a group of people felt compelled to work with the Departments of Interior and Commerce to develop guidelines for harmonizing the federal trust responsibility, American Indian tribal rights, and the responsibilities for administering the Endangered Species Act. There have been conflicts that have been arisen between agency missions. For example, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a pretty narrow mission in terms of protection of the fish and wildlife resources, that very often they fail to recognize the importance and significance of fish and wildlife to tribal communities. A few years ago, they had developed an American Indian policy for the Fish and Wildlife Service. We recognized that that policy needed to be revamped and pressed for the establishment of a work group to redevelop and recraft the Native American Fish and Wildlife policy for the Fish and Wildlife Service. There have been conflicts that have arisen in legislation that, for example, when the treaty fishing rights controversy was hot and heavy several decades ago, and there were people that were pressing for abrogation of Indian treaty rights. We had very powerful congressional forces that were at work to try to abrogate or negate Indian treaty fishing rights. So an effort was undertaken and partnerships were forged to change that mindset within the Congress. So it changed from abrogation, and that group, we changed the mindset from abrogation to one of recognition that there were some real serious problems with the way in which our salmon and steelhead resources were being managed and things that had to be addressed. So we pressed Congress to establish and pass the Salmon and Steelhead Conservation and Enhancement Act and form a commission, which I was a member of, to study and make some recommendations as to how we can address some of the real problems that are facing the management of salmon and steelhead of the Pacific Northwest for the benefit of the resource and all people. So I probably got maybe too far afield. If you have any other questions, just feel free to send them my way.
That was very helpful. Thank you, Gary, for sharing.
Hi, Gary. I have a question. This is James Rawlingleaf. Good to see you, Gary.
Hi, James. Good to see you.
Even though I don't have my camera on here, I'm a little shy this morning. But Gary, thank you for your presentation again, and thank you for your good work with the Quinault. I know just mentioning how long you've been working for the tribe and with the tribe is very impressive, and certainly we follow your work. You know, we study your work and we pay attention when you speak. I was real interested in your comment about the nation, the tribal, the Quinault Nation getting more involved internationally, and also I know that you've been doing a lot of work on indigenous knowledge, especially with the guidelines document that was produced. Could you comment on sort of the future of how traditional knowledge can be incorporated or is incorporated into the IPCC process, and what that might look like, and how can we, those of us, also participate in contributing traditional knowledge to that work? Thank you.
Well, it comes into play in many ways, James. I think that one of the things to recognize is that the close ties between place and resources and people that tribal communities have enjoyed for many generations gives them some history. It gives them a baseline to understand and see what's going on around them and to see the change. They may not know the causes for those changes or their observations, but they have seen many changes before and recognize things like the phenology is changing. For example, the timing of when plants bloom, or when there's pollination going on, or when fish come back to the rivers, or seeing many of these things that are changes and happening. So there's a very strong role, I think, for tribes to bring that observational power to bear in terms of understanding and monitoring change at the local scale. Too often we see things get caught up in sort of the top-down approach, where people say one size fits all. We want to have a policy that, or a program that's designed to fit as many different situations as they can, but in doing so, it really fits none. So local adaptation, local knowledge, and the importance of place, language, those kinds of things, you can't really codify in any sort of a policy. That you've got to rely upon local knowledge and expertise, tribal science, to tell you what's going on, to tell you what may be possible, and how to actually implement and effect change. One of the things that I've really enjoyed working with and learning about over the years is the difference in how decisions are made in tribal communities. It's not sort of dictatorial or top down, that decisions are really made through dialogue and through deliberation, that you have a process that involves an opportunity for people to have their say, to express their opinions, to share, for elders to come in and share their views and knowledge and perspectives about what's important and what needs to be dealt with. That kind of deliberative process is really essential for us to understand that there are many worldviews, many perspectives that have to be considered and brought to bear to solve today's difficult challenges.
You for that, Gary. And Gary, this is Chaz Jones, the Tribal Liaison at the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and working with the affiliated tribes, Northwest Indians. And I really respect the amount of experience and expertise and wisdom, frankly, that you bring to this topic. And it's really, really valuable. And I know Fawn Sharp is the president of the National Congress of American Indians, and she has the ear of policymakers nationwide and probably globally as well. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe Fawn's opinions or your own on if you could get policymakers to act in one or two specific actions, what would be your top priorities for getting policymakers to move on climate action or climate policy?
Well, my top priorities are basically finding a way to overcome indifference and ignorance. One of the challenges that we face with climate change is that it has so many dimensions, that it influences our lives in so many different ways, that what's important to one person is not important to another. What's important to one business is not important to another. So we've got all these different forces that come to bear. But in order to understand how they fit together, you have to overcome ignorance and indifference. The way that we try to do that at Quinault is to put science at the forefront, whether it's Western science or tribal science, that whatever our decisions have to be made on the basis of the best information that we can make available to take into account the ramifications and the implications, and to do so with a perspective of stewardship. Again, tying the tribal perspective of time and cycles and all these things together, that you have to understand that where we are today was influenced by what happened yesterday or even hundreds or thousands of years ago. It's an accumulation of forces and things that have come to manifest themselves today. It also means that when we make decisions today, we have a responsibility for future generations, a responsibility to future generations, to not foreclose their options and opportunities, but rather to recognize that we have to leave them in a place where they have choices that they're going to be able to make in the future. So stewardship, overcoming ignorance and indifference are the primary challenges, I think, that we're trying to find a way of dealing with. And to bring that message to bear to a wider audience, I think that when Fawn does that, she finds people are very receptive to that. They can identify and not just merely dismiss her as another politician or so, but they recognize that her feelings are genuine, that her beliefs are genuine, and that she's committed to make a difference.
Thank you for that.
I had a question to follow up on that topic, Gary. Just thinking about the next generation and kind of the process that you all are thinking about for enabling relocation and enabling the next generation of leaders to address some of the impacts that we're seeing and are going to see in the future. Can you talk a little bit about how Quinault has done that, how it's either supported the next generation or created leaders like Fawn Sharp that have been really effective at getting the message out and moving things forward to address climate change?
Well, one of the things that is a bit really unique about Quinault is stable leadership. For many years, when I first started working with Quinault, the leader was Joe Dela Cruz, and he was a tribal chairman for many years. He was followed by Pearl Kapoman Ballard, and Pearl was followed by Fawn. Now, all of these are leaders that are well respected and in place for many cycles. That kind of leadership and continuity over time provides you with some stability both in terms of the what they're trying to accomplish and their ability to maintain an environment where it's possible to attract and retain people that recognize that they can make a difference. People that by working with the tribe, they're able to bring to bear some resources, some perspectives that are important for other people to be aware of. It's a problem that I come up against quite frequently in terms of trying to deal with things like traditional knowledge, where there's all too often a belief amongst those that are really rooted in the training that we receive at universities and elsewhere, that there's only one kind of science. It's got to be replicable, it's got to be experimental, it's got to be universal, and it's got to be value-free. And none of those are really true. That science is always changing. That the circumstance, the context in which science is applied are vital and important to recognize and understand. So the uniqueness and the necessity to adapt science and information to the situation at hand, the circumstances that you're facing, the decisions that you're trying to make, have to be recognized and of course brought to fruition if you're going to make decisions that are going to serve the future generations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. Any other questions out there for Gary while we have him? I guess not seeing any other questions. The one last thing I guess I've been really curious. I mean, you've been doing this work for a lot of years, and you've seen it change, and you've seen different people enter the fray. And I think a lot of your presentation kind of speaks to these overarching themes and kind of what you're seeing with this broader perspective. So I guess I'm curious about how you see the future going and kind of what you would like to see in the next 10, 20, 30 years at Quinault or more broadly Washington State or the US or globally, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, one of the things that we recognize, if we're going to deal with some of the global challenges that we're facing today, these are long-term issues. It's going to require a sustained effort over time, which means, from my perspective anyway, that the primary need is really to focus on developing effective agents of change people that have the knowledge and perspectives and ability to be able to bring about change. And that change has to come from all different levels. It has to permeate things from the educational system that we have to the social and economic and political systems that come into play. So in order to effect change, you've got to influence attitudes, you've got to influence the way in which people perceive their place within the world. It's no longer a situation where people can afford to believe that they're apart from everything around them, that they're apart from the world. And you've got to change that perspective to recognize that, as the tribal people do, that we are a part of the world, not apart from it. That there's a certain amount of recognition that has to be given, that there are things that are really beyond our ability to control as humans, that things are going to happen, and that we have to have the ability to adapt and to respond to different circumstances, to respond effectively to change. And that means that we've got to have people that have the information, the knowledge, and the mindsets to be real agents of change. Now, I call them sort of eco-warriors because they're going to have to fight lots of different fronts in order to bring about that change.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. It looks like I have another question in the chat box for you. What advice would you offer to a tribe that is just starting out on their climate adaptation journey? The big picture can be so overwhelming. What are some of the first tangible steps and actions that can help?
Well, there are a number of things I think that are important. One of them is to try to bring about an awareness and an awareness of change, and an awareness that their tribes or their leaders are not powerless, that they can bring effective influences of the changes that need to be made in order to address things like climate. So it's easy to become sort of overwhelmed. There's so many things going on, and they're so powerful, and they're so hard to grasp that you can feel helpless, and you can feel frustrated and discouraged real easily. But that doesn't help. So what you have to do, I think, is to find and convince leadership by example, by information, about why it's important to engage in things like climate change, why it's important to undertake and prepare for the change that's going to come. So it's not something like, gee, I can go out and get a grant, write a plan, and it's done. That isn't how things are going to change, because a plan is just going to be little more than carbon on paper in the end, that you've got to be able to implement it. Like the village relocation project that I was described today, that the plan is just that. It is a plan. It does not mean implementation or reality. So in order to convert a plan to reality, you've got to understand if there are opportunities that are going to arise, and be able to recognize those opportunities and take advantage of them. You've got to be able to build those partnerships with your colleagues. There's a lot of help out there nowadays with organizations like the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and the climate centers and climate hubs. Those kinds of resources were not there a few years ago. And they're important resources for people to be aware of. Places where they can get information, places where they can talk to their colleagues and get some advice, places where they might be able to gain some access to not only expertise, but resources in order to study problems that they may think that they need more information on, to find ways in which they can get the funds and the staff to help implement whatever plans or decisions may be forthcoming from their communities. It's very hard, I know, there's so many pressures that are facing tribal leadership to be able to bring things like climate change to the forefront. But you have to find a way of doing that. And very often that means that you can't get involved in things like lengthy dissertations or lengthy scientific explanations about, tell everybody how much you know, that kind of thing. Very often you've got sort of the elevator speech. That's what I call it. You've got very short bursts of time where you can capture attention. And you've got to be prepared to make the most of that, to make your case so that they can understand why it's important, what it is that you're asking them to do, what is it that they can do in order to actually bring about the kind of change that's going to be necessary for us to be able to contend with things on a sustained basis, things like climate change or COVID, whatever it is, these aren't one-time things, not things that you can say, snap your fingers, here's the answer, and go do it, because things are going to change, and you're going to have the capability and capacity to contend with that change.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. That's really helpful. It gave me a ton of things to think about. Actually, I was thinking about that with limited attention spans and trying to get your message across. It's, I think, really relevant for a lot of us working in this space. Well, thank you again. Looks like some other folks are saying thanks for your experience and wisdom and for sharing. And I think if you have more questions to Gary, feel free to reach out directly to him. You can also reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns or feedback. I'll probably also be following up with a questionnaire, about 4 questions, just to ask how you like the webinar and what we can improve in the future to make the information always more useful and relevant. Hard to do that after Gary set such a high bar. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, one last thing, Stefan. On the second slide of my presentation, I've given my email and phone number. Just everybody feel free to get in contact with me should you want to chat some more.
Great. Thanks so much, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.